Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is Priestess Erica. And before I get started into this current topic, the reason that this topic came up, and actually the reason most of these topics come up, is because of conversations that I have in my life and questions that people ask me. Most of the time, people is my partner, as I'm not a particularly social person. But there are certainly other people that ask me questions that inspire these talks. There's a lot of stuff that I have bouncing around in my head and in my heart that I have been pondering over the years, and most of it is stuff that I either assume other people don't want to know about, or I feel like other people already know about, which is the downfall of most of us who have any kind of training expertise, channeling, anything like that. Anything that you think that other people also know, which is not usually accurate. Certainly, there are some people who also have that knowledge, but most people generally don't. So that's a long-winded way of saying, as I start this video, that if you watch any of my videos and they inspire a question or a comment in you, please leave that comment or that question behind in the comment section below. I do monitor them, and I am always looking for more inspiration. If you have a question about some kind of spiritual topic, it's probably something I've thought about before, and if I haven't, it's something that I definitely want to think about, honestly. And I would be super happy to talk about it, to share my thoughts and experiences if I have them, any channeled knowledge that I've received, and all of that. So today we are going to discuss a topic that's a bit controversial, but probably not for most of you watching this channel. But if it's something you've ever wondered about, then here's your exploration. My partner lately has been doing a lot of study of some of the monotheistic traditions out there. And both he and I come from a Christian background, so we have that, and we've both been religions and theology nerds ever since long before we left Christianity. So we have a lot of study there before we went anywhere else. So as he was studying these traditions, their writings, that kind of a thing, he had this wondering of what happens if these people who are receiving these holy writings, if they truly are receiving a channeled message, then why is it that it goes so sideways, in the sense of insisting that there is only one truth and that any other truth that anybody has found is absolutely wrong, and to the point of, and certainly monotheistic traditions aren't the only ones guilty of this, but throughout our history they have been some of the greater perpetrators of this sort of violence that comes with these traditions that say, this is the only truth, I've got it and you don't, and I have been commanded by my deity to conquer you, to bring you the truth in a violent way, whatever it is. So he was having this wondering as he was reading these scriptures and considering the possibility that they are in fact truly divinely inspired works. And I also struggle with this, and have struggled with this for a while. And as he asked me this question, this is what often happens. He'll ask me a question about something I've never specifically thought about before. I have never specifically thought about this question of the revelation of monotheism and how that happened and how that fits into what I know to be true about the spiritual world. But after he asked me, all of these thoughts just kind of came out and together, a combination both of channeling and of the fact that this has been in my mind, kind of brewing in the subconscious for a long time, even though I hadn't articulated any of these thoughts. So the way that I see the spiritual realm, and that I know I'm not alone in this, and this is certainly a topic that we could dive into just completely on its own another time, is something that's kind of in between a polytheistic viewpoint and a pantheistic viewpoint. And I say that it's sort of in between because on the one hand, all of the deities that have revealed themselves to humankind, I would say, are their own people, their own entities. They are not some um, they're not some sort of name that this name applies to this one particular deity and there are 5 other names that apply to them across different cultures. I'm not sure that that's how that works exactly. I think that each of these individuals, each of these deities, entities, are themselves individuals. However, the other thing that I know to be true about all of us, both non-corporeal entities, deified spirits and non-deified spirits, the spirits like you and I that are here embodied in this experience right now, all of us are parts of a greater soul. There's a really great line from a Rumi poem that the drop is in the ocean, but the ocean is also in the drop. So here's a revelation that's been coming through so many different people over so many thousands of years, and that is that we are each a part of the divine, but something that's bigger than what we think of most of the time when we think of any individual deity, no matter who that happens to be. But this sort of divine oversoul, and the oversoul being a greater soul than our individuated soul, if you will, but the place where our individuated soul came from. Essentially, there is this ocean of soul energy, let's say, before anybody splits off, which was a very, very long time ago. um, and and this singular being then split into all of us. And so on the one hand, we're all different entities from that singular being, and on the other hand, we're kind of not. It's similar, it's all this technology we have nowadays. It makes for really great metaphors. It's similar to if you're playing a video game, the kind of video game where you can design characters and you have, say, 6 different character avatars that you use in the video game. Well, each of those character avatars are separate, and you have given them each different strengths and weaknesses, which is why you have multiples usually, so you can try out different configurations. And depending on the game you're playing, each of them might even have different backstories, different histories, all of that kind of stuff. But really, you are the energy, the entity that is behind all 6 of them, even though they're all different. And that's basically the same kind of concept here, just on a totally different level, where the individual who is, if you will, playing the characters is a spirit that's bigger than that, and we are the characters that they've created and are playing. So essentially, that's what we're talking about here. And this is where I think that monotheism and the revelations of monotheism have, like most things, there is truth in them. I certainly disagree that there is a singular, true with a capital T, divine being, that if you don't follow this particular divine being, you're going to be in some kind of terrible trouble, usually some sort of punishment-based thing, which I think is probably not accurate either. But regardless, this concept of there being a singular divine being, it's only just a few shades from the truth. And this is often the case when humans usually get something a little bit wrong, and then it goes very wrong after that. It usually started in a place where it was really close to the thing that is true. And then it just sort of took a turn at some point and somebody really ran with it. Um, and typically these turns are when in this case that we're talking about, when the spiritual or religious framework becomes useful for wielding power and becomes then politically useful. And this has happened time and time again with multiple traditions. We know a lot of the details about how this happened with Christianity, but it's certainly not the only tradition that this has happened with. So this is part of the problem with these almost revelations. And sometimes the problem is the prophet themselves, the person who is receiving the revelation, that they either receive a partial revelation and don't look any deeper, or what they're receiving is so colored by their own biases. There's this concept of a clear channel. If you're going to receive channeled messages from spirit, you want to be a clear channel. You don't want a lot of your stuff, your emotions, your personal biases, those kind of things getting in the way of and flavoring the message that you're receiving from spirit in a way that's unhelpful. So sometimes I think that's the problem, that not every channel is super clear, and most of most people, most of them who are not super clear, are also not super self-aware that they're not super clear. So what they receive, it is coming from a divine source, from a deified source, and it feels very true because of that, and whatever they're receiving usually is. But then, of course, like with anything that we perceive, however we perceive it, whether it's something in the physical that we're perceiving, or not, whatever our biases are come into play. So if you and I are looking at the same object, we might describe it totally differently. And that might be because we're sitting in different places, we're seeing it from different angles, and it looks differently from one angle or another. Or perhaps there's a difference in how I perceive color versus you, and so we both perceive the thing differently, even though what it is separately is a singular thing. We're seeing different faces of it. So this is part of the problem. And once you see that face, if you don't understand that you're not seeing the whole picture, you think that what you've seen is absolutely the truth. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, in most cases, particularly when it comes to spiritual revelations, what we are receiving is only part of the truth. And a lot of that is because of our human capacity to process these messages. These messages are so big and so powerful most of the time that they are beyond our human capability to process them. And so we process what we can, which is again, then it goes through that filter of our biases and the way that we perceive things and the way that we understand the world, because we all have that. Um, and then this message comes out, whether it's a message that's for you personally or for you to share with your people. Either way. So I think that one of the biggest mistakes that anyone who is a prophet or a channel, or whatever title it is they use for themselves, can make is to say that this revelation that I have received and I'm relaying to you in this particular way right now is the absolute truth for now and all eternity, because that really ignores the fact that it did come through you and your biases, and that your human perception is not adequate to really completely perceive the whole message that you were sent in its entirety. So that's a really tricky deal there. And of course, there's also the factor that plenty of prophets, plenty of channels receive their messages in that kind of way where they've received the message, they're sharing it, and they're not claiming that this is the truth for now and all eternity, for all people everywhere ever. But somebody finds their message later and decides that that's the case. Um, and this I would say happens almost more frequently than the other, although they both happen with pretty alarming levels of frequency. And so I feel like anytime that you are exploring any kind of spiritual tradition and there is an insistence that this is the only truth, that's a problem, and apply that to anything that I say as well, absolutely. because because even through the course of my life and the spiritual revelations that I've been receiving since I was a child, looking back at some of those versus what I receive now, I can see the truth that was in those revelations I received as a child, but I can also see now more layers of that truth, more levels of that truth, a greater understanding of that truth than I had when I was 10, of course, because I'm a different person now with lots more life experience. Um, and lots more experience of dealing with the guides and spirits that I deal with. But because of that, that means that there are no truths that are immutable, really, as far as we can perceive them with our minds. Certainly there are truths that are true for what they are, for now and all time, for all people everywhere. But, and this is a huge but, it's really unlikely that any human, probably ever in the past or the future, will ever be able to completely understand that truth, and then be able, if they happen to be able to do that. And certainly, for some of us, at moments we have these moments of what feel like perfect lucidity and perfect understanding, and those moments may or may not be actually true, but they certainly feel that they're true. But as soon as you're not in that moment anymore, even if you have a very clear remembrance of what you experienced in that moment, you are not still connected to that same level of understanding. And so if you are trying to further clarify your revelation while you're not in that space, now you're just taking your memories and your human thought capacity and combining those to come up with things that may be very good. They may be wonderful, wise sayings that are very helpful to a lot of people, but you're again no longer connected. So what I think happens with these monotheistic revelations is I think that the prophet receives a message about there being a one overall, as it were, the source of everything, what I like to call the oversoul, this entity that we all are a part of and all are, including all um, non-corporeal spirits, which includes all deities, including deities of monotheistic traditions and deities of polytheistic and pantheistic traditions, all of them. We're all a part of this great oversoul, except that I think these prophets either did not clearly understand, or by the time they went to write it down, they had lost the clear understanding, um, or they simply did not communicate the clear understanding in a way that people who listened to them and who read what they wrote could then also themselves clearly understand it, so that we didn't lose anything in the process. And that's, of course, a big challenge with any kind of communication, is that you do tend to lose things in the process of communication. So the idea that there is one God, as it were, I would say is not entirely wrong, but it's also not entirely true the way that we mostly talk about it and understand it nowadays. And it's possible that some of these prophets who had these monotheistic revelations, that the revelation they had was accurate and that it was a revelation. Like Rumi obviously had this revelation, although he's not somebody we talk about as being a great prophet in most traditions. But he obviously had this revelation of, we're all part of this much bigger soul entity, and that is the all that is. That is God, essentially. Um, and so it's a tricky concept to really talk about, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on this channel in future videos, all these tricky concepts. Um, and of course, if you don't explain very clearly that what you mean when you say there's only one God is that everything, we all other deities are a part of this greater deity that you're talking about, well, now you end up with revelations that talk about how some deities are evil, and that worshiping them is an affront to your current deity. And while certainly I would have to say some deities are absolutely jealous, that doesn't mean that other deities are invalid. And that's often where monotheism has taken people, even though there are some really interesting things in the Bible. I'm going to use that one because that's the one I'm familiar with. In the Old Testament, which of course the Old Testament I've studied is the Christian Old Testament, which is, we can maybe talk about that another time if you're interested, this difference between the Jewish scriptures and the Christian Old Testament, and how interesting it is that Christianity has what they have. But in any case, in the Christian Old Testament, in the places where there are passages talking about how jealous God, Yahweh, is, and that therefore you shouldn't worship anybody else, and in fact these other deities are even not even deities, in fact they're evil spirits or something. But there are other parts where it acknowledges that they are deities, but you just shouldn't worship them because Yahweh is jealous. And that I can accept, honestly. After having spoken to some deities and worked with a bunch of deities, I know that some of them are very jealous, and that's fine. Like that's who they are as a person, and that's okay. If you choose to work with that, you choose to work with that. But it doesn't mean that it invalidates others. That's like saying, I'm a holistic veterinarian. In fact, I am the holistic veterinarian. And if you go to any other person who's calling themselves a holistic veterinarian, you're just fooling yourself, because there's no way that they could be a holistic veterinarian. And of course, that's ridiculous. Of course, that's ridiculous. We may have different skill levels. Obviously, we'll have different personalities and different ways that we practice and all of that. But But just because I am a holistic veterinarian doesn't mean it invalidates the existence of every other holistic veterinarian. So thinking that somehow that's how it works with deities is very strange, honestly. And I do sometimes wonder how much of that idea is coming from the prophets, from the channels themselves, and how much of it is actually coming from the people who are using these holy texts or the teachings that they've heard, however it is that the teaching is being spread, them for themselves. And they maybe even think they're doing a service to society because when they heard this message from the prophet, they were so moved, they felt like their life changed and all of this kind of thing, but they don't themselves have a direct connection to the deity, and now they're going to go and teach about what they learned, which obviously they may not have learned everything completely. And especially if there's no written texts, even if there are written texts, there's loads of arguments about interpretation, but especially when there aren't written texts, it's so much easier to kind of tweak things a little bit for your own personal agenda when there's no written record anywhere that tells people this was what the original message was. So I think that this is where things have gone wrong. Either whoever's receiving the message receives this message of there is one God. We are all one is actually a part of that message. If you've ever read a Dr. Bronner's bottle, all are one, that is the heart of what I'm talking about here. And the way that it's written on the bottle is a little kind of manic seeming and seems a little funny when you read it, but it's true. We are all one, every single one of us. Those of us who are animals, those of us who are plants, those of us who are non-corporeal, we're all one at our true root. So that's true. But in the human concepts of self and other and how we conceptualize truth as humans, if you receive the message, there is only one, then that immediately makes you want to go tell everybody that there's only one God. And anybody who's worshiping anyone other than the God who gave you this revelation is clearly worshiping a false God. But that's not what the message was. This is part of the problem. So the message that is received is there is only one. And the way that the humans take that is there's only one God. But that's not what there's only one means. There's only one means there's only one, not just one God, but only one being who has now split into billions, billions upon billions of other beings, but we are still truly all one, and we are all connected to each other. And this is one of the great spiritual truths that lots of people talk about. And if you do journeying meditations, these kinds of spiritual exercises, using the spiritual technology of meditation and those kinds of things, this is often a truth that you will brush up against because it is true. And of course, take that with a grain of salt, and your mileage may vary, and let's see what your experience is. But certainly my experience and plenty of other people who are teachers and those who are not teachers but are seekers have also found this to be true. So there is only one is very easy to interpret to mean there is only one God. So I think that's point number one about where this, what I would call the mistake of monotheism, comes from, at least this monotheistic idea that there is only one God, not a monotheistic idea of we should worship only one God. Those are two different concepts. They're often combined and conflated in our society and our understanding of religion and monotheism, but they are two different concepts. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with this idea of there's only one God that we should worship. Perhaps it's our family God, our tribal God, whoever this deity is, the God who saved us from some kind of disaster, and therefore this is the God that we worship. Whatever, that's fine. If you choose to worship only one deity, cool. Technically, that makes you monotheistic, I guess. But then, of course, there's also this idea that monotheism means you don't believe there are any other deities at all, whether you worship them or not. And there is some evidence in, again, the Christian scriptures, Old Testament, that that's not the way things always were in a monotheistic tradition, Christianity. in particular, although what we're talking about are stolen scriptures from Judaism. Um, there's a particular passage where Yahweh God sits in the council of the gods and addresses the gods of these other people. And they are spoken about as being gods in this particular passage. And so there is an acknowledgement that other gods exist and that they are, in fact, deities and not just some other kind of lower spirit or whatever, in a monotheistic scripture. So that's something to bear in mind. But this idea that there's only one God and there is only one God is not quite right. I mean, like we've just finished exploring in our journey to get here, on the one hand, sure, that's true because there is only one. We are all, including deified spirits, only the one at our source, at our root. But since then, we have split into myriad who are still connected to the one and therefore still connected to all of each other. And so we're all still one, but there's lots of us now also. It's a very interesting spiritual paradox. So either this is misinterpreted at the level of spirit speaking to prophet, or it is misinterpreted when the prophet comes out, when Dr. Bronner comes out and says, there's only one. We are all one. All are one. Whatever it is that, however it is Dr. Bronner says it. When Dr. Bronner comes out and says that, even though we'll say, I don't know anything really about him as a person, but we'll say that Dr. Bronner received a true revelation that all are one, that there is only one, and that we are all a part of that one. By reading the scripture of the shampoo bottles, I would say that this is an accurate representation, but again, I don't know a whole lot about him. Now, maybe that level, so spirit to prophet, is good. Spirit said something to Dr. Bronner wrote it on his shampoo bottles, and good, everything's great. But now somebody like, say, me comes along and reads the Dr. Bronner soap bottle, and I read these messages about all are one, and I think to myself, of course, he's talking about there's only one true God. And this is an amazing, profound spiritual message that I have just received from this prophet, Dr. Bronner, and I need to share it with the world. So now I start doing that. But of course, the revelation is not mine. And all I know about the revelation is what's written on the soap bottle. If I'm lucky, maybe I get to speak to the prophet and get direct teachings, direct transmissions from the prophet or the channel. And that maybe gives me a little better understanding. But if I am not myself the prophet or the channel, and I'm the one who's going to go and teach people about this transmission, that's already a challenge, because if they ask me a question, I want to know the answer. I want to have the answer. I want to be able to give them the answer. I'm here telling them I have a deep spiritual truth that I'm going to teach them. So I teach them. And they have questions, of course, because that is the nature of the human mind, is to question. And so they ask me a question. And I'm a teacher, so I feel a need to have the answer for them. So instead of saying, I don't know, or let me talk to the prophet, if the prophet's even still available to speak to, Dr. Bronner, for instance, is not. So if I was spreading Dr. Bronner's gospel, it would be a bit tricky if someone asked me a question that wasn't covered by the soap bottle, because I'm not the one receiving the direct transmission, and Dr. Bronner is no longer on this plane with us. So what do? I make some inferences from the soap bottle as best I can, and if it's not at all covered by the soap bottle, well, then I make some stuff up. And if we're lucky, I am also a prophet and also really connected and channeling things. And so what I'm delivering now as the new revelation is also coming from the same source, which would be great. But most of the time, that's not how it works, especially as these traditions expand. The great monotheistic traditions that we talk about, great meaning large and long-standing, relatively long-standing, most of them have been spread pretty zealously by lots of people who are likely not super connected, clear channels, or not themselves prophets. What they are doing is repeating their understanding of what has already been received, which that's not wrong in and of itself, of course. But the more people that you get doing that, and the higher the stakes are, the more challenges arise. We know that that lots of people who haven't dealt with their own issues are very susceptible to being corrupted into taking power over others. This is one of the big challenges in our society right now, is this power over dynamic that we have all been playing with as beings here in the physical for some time. Um, and it's a really popular dynamic and has been for quite a while. And of course, people like to find stories to tell the people they want to have power over that make it easier for them to hold power over those people. And, we also have these, most of us have these deeply rooted sentiments about how we should take care of people, we should be a good person, whatever that means to us, and so on and so forth. Particularly, if you're following one of these monotheistic religions, for most of them, they involve some kind of teaching like that. So now, if you're going to use that teaching to take power over other people, probably you're going to need to create some rules or something that allow you to feel like it is your divine place to be in power over them, and that you're doing them a favor by being in power over them. In part so that it's easier for you to convince yourself it's okay to do this, because a lot of people, even when they are highly corrupted individuals, are still having a struggle with this at a soul level, because truly the nature of their soul is not to be that way. This is the nature of lots of other things that have been piled on top. So the monotheistic tradition, with its insistence that we have the only truth, we have the whole truth, only come to us for truth, is very convenient if you're trying to create a mythology that creates a feeling like it is natural for there to be a hierarchical order among human beings, and that it's natural for the king to be in charge and for the crown to pass to their descendants. Because that's how God has ordained it to be. And we do not question God. We do not question God's messengers, because we have the truth with a capital T. And if you go away from that truth, then you're going to be punished severely. So the other challenging part is this idea of having the whole truth, and the exclusive truth lends itself to this kind of unquestionable trust among followers, which then makes it very easy to take advantage of those people and to hold power over them. So if you have stumbled across this video and you're not actually a part of the people who are my usual audience, and you're somebody who has stumbled across this video because you are either thinking about your monotheistic stances, or you are yourself extremely monotheistic, and you're not reconsidering it, I would urge you to at least consider this part, that this idea that your tradition has the only truth, the only revelation of truth for all of humanity, and that falling outside of that is something that should be punished severely, is an incredible setup for someone to take advantage of you. So even if you don't question your religious and spiritual convictions, certainly question the temporal religious leaders that exist. Because again, unless they are themselves prophets or clear channels, they're not actually tuned in to even the deity that you are following. And so what they're telling you may just be coming from themselves. And in the recent past, we have seen a rise in popularity, although having been connected to the charismatic community and the Pentecostal community, I have known that these people have existed for a long time, but we're seeing this surge into the popular consciousness of evangelicalism as a whole. So this is very specifically about Christianity, of people who are calling themselves prophets nowadays. This happened. I don't really want to talk about politics a lot on this channel, but here we go. This happened a lot around the last election, when all of these prophets were coming out of the woodwork saying that Trump was going to win. And then when he didn't, they all changed their story and said, oh, well, it's going to happen in the near future. And it's been quite a while now, and it still hasn't happened. So yeah, I think those prophets are wrong, which means either they might still be truly prophets. They might still be people who are actually connected to spirit and receiving messages from spirit, but they just got it wrong. Sometimes if you're not a clear channel, your stuff gets in the way. Or there have been times when my intuition has told me one thing so that I would act a certain way, so that I would go down the path I needed to go down and get the lessons I needed to get. even when I looked back and considered what I thought my intuition was telling me that led me down that path, and realized that if I took that as a factual statement, it's actually factually incorrect. Um, that doesn't mean the guidance that I got was wrong necessarily, but it does mean that what I thought it was, that a certain statement was true, for example, is inaccurate. And so when your prophecy doesn't match up with reality, you've got to figure out why, instead of just doubling and tripling and quadrupling down all the time, which is what most of these people were doing. And some of them still are doing, even though it has been quite a while at this point. So they are a great example. There are so many people that still believe them, even though at this point, these individuals within the last calendar year have had numerous failed prophecies, which, even if you're coming at this strictly from a Christian perspective, that's a problem. When the Bible has places where it talks about how to assess prophets, and failed prophecies are one of the things that should be making you question a prophet. And I say this now as someone who's not a Christian and talking about prophets and channels in any regard. If somebody is giving you incorrect information, whether they're a channel, psychic, whatever they call themselves, they're receiving information that is purportedly from spirit and it's turning out to be incorrect, you need to investigate why. And if it's you, like I've personally had these experiences, it's even more important to investigate why. If you consider yourself to be a connected person, a channel, a prophet, however you call yourself, if you've received information, say that you were one of these people who received information that Trump was going to win the election and then he didn't, instead of just immediately turning around and saying, well, actually, it probably means that it's just going to be overturned here in a month. Instead of doing that, you should really be pulling back and doing some deep examination of, why did this happen? Why did I receive a message that ended up wrong? Or I thought I received this message and it ended up wrong. This is a huge problem. Anybody who doesn't do that, I really feel like they actually aren't true prophets, in the sense of, sure, maybe they're sometimes connected to spirit and maybe they sometimes get messages that may or may not be biased or whatever. But if they aren't questioning their own connection and the messages that they are receiving, then who are you to not question it, really? If they're not questioning it, somebody's got to question it. So a lot of times when prophets or channels are questioning the things that come to them, it's very private. But when we see somebody doing what these many people have been doing, where their prophecy is wrong and so they just double and triple and quadruple down, that tells me that there's not a lot of self-examination going on. And in those cases, we are much more likely to have these kinds of dangerous people who believe that what they are doing is for your good. And they believe the messages they are receiving are for you and, again, for your good. When in fact, most of what's running the show are their shadow parts that they have shoved into the background. And so the shadow parts are making commentary and filtering things on a subconscious level. And these people aren't recognizing it because they are very busy shoving all those things in the shadow actively and definitely not examining them. And so a lot of their, what we might call lower or more negative desires, are actually running the show, even if they don't know it. And so this is the really challenging part that happens with any tradition. Monotheism does not have an exclusive contract on these kinds of false spiritual leaders. We have seen them rise in many different traditions across a whole lot of time. But the phenomenon of monotheism and this sort of message of we have the only truth, and how widespread that has become, and again, how it leads to followers who have been taught from often infancy, certainly I was taught from infancy, to not question things, that's very dangerous. Very dangerous. Because if you do have the truth, if you really do, then you should be able to question it and it should stand up to that. So I found personally, when I started questioning monotheism, that it did not stand up to my questioning, and that in fact this sort of polypantheistic approach that I have is the only approach, as far as these kinds of ideas that stood up to any kind of questioning, and that can explain most things that I get asked about this. And certainly for myself, the questions that I have come up with, it has managed to explain them far better than monotheism ever did for me. Um, so again, to really just hit the two main points here. The two main points are that the message that many of us receive from Spirit, and I know this is true because I've received it myself, and I've heard it from many other people who've received messages from Spirit. The message many of us receive from Spirit is all are one. There is only one. And if you are accepting that and seeing that completely, what you see is our interconnectedness as beings, and all beings, not just humans with other humans, but humans with other animals, humans with plants, humans with rocks, with the soil, with the earth herself, with everything outside of the earth, with all non-corporeal spirits. We are all one, and we are all connected, which is a really great, wonderful, deep spiritual truth. But again, it's very easy to get that confused with there is only one God, which is quite different than saying there is only one. And then of course, this concept of there's only one God, and I am the one who has access to him, and you don't have access to him. But let me tell you what God wants, and I can tell you that our God is the only God, and that the truths that I receive from our God are the only truths. This is a these are typical red flags of a cult, but we don't say that about the major monotheistic traditions because they're so big, even though they are doing exactly those things. And of course, there are some variations on the theme, and like I said, there are ways to believe in a relatively monotheistic way that don't put these kind of boundaries on truth and make it so that we are the sole owners of truth. I mean, come on, how ignorant can you be, really? Like, really? I know that this tradition started before this, but many of the problems started around this time with colonization and imperialism, that we Northwestern Europeans, with a God who's not even our real God, if we're talking about ancestral deities, Yahweh is not the Northwestern European ancestral deity, that we somehow suddenly have the truth, and that all of these indigenous nations that we have come across and conquered and colonized, that somehow what they have is not the truth. Well, that's very convenient. And that sounds much more sarcastic than I would like it to sound, but that's exactly how I feel about this. And it really proves the point that this is just too convenient for what I would call oh less what's the best way to put this? This is a really challenging thing for me to say, because I would like to call these the lower and lesser desires of humanity, these power over desires. But this game of power over, it's very complex. So I've been learning to make peace with it lately and try not to be so antagonistic, but it's really hard. And in part because it's clear that this game is kind of serving no one at this point, although we are all here to have the experiences we came to have, and apparently for a lot of us, power over dynamics are things that we wanted to play with in one way or another. Although at this point, I think we're reaching a point where the playing with the power over dynamics is coming to a close. We're starting to realize corporately that this isn't working, that this isn't the best way, that interconnectedness is much better than power over. I hope we can figure that out fast enough to not murder the entire earth. When I said earlier that I didn't really want to get political on these videos, I'm talking about specific politics, party politics kind of things. I'm a feminist, and therefore I believe that the personal is political. Everything is political. Absolutely everything is political. And of course, we're talking about spirituality, which is highly political. And we're talking about earth-based religions, and therefore taking care of the earth, which anymore apparently is also highly political. So in any case, be very careful of anybody, monotheistic or not, who claims to have the only truth, the entire lease on truth, because that is usually a quick way for them to gain power over you. And, like I said, most of these people, I would like to think, and I know for sure when I was stuck in it, that I wasn't doing this out of a conscious, intentional desire to wield power over other people, although that's certainly the results that I was getting. Uh, that's not what I thought I wanted. That's not why I thought I was engaging in this particular religion and these particular ethics, but that's what I was getting out of it. And with more self examination and more spiritual growth and doing the shadow work and bringing those um, darker aspects, although dark doesn't mean evil. Dark in this case means something that I decided was no good and shoved into the darkness, and where it became then an actor doing things on its own in ways that maybe were not awesome. These orphaned children, essentially, that these shadow aspects that we shove into the shadow are orphaned children who we have abandoned, and so of course they act out. But that doesn't mean that that's their nature. So these shadow characteristics, once we bring them out and integrate them, now we're a more complete being, and now they're playing along with the whole group. So when a revelation comes, or when we get information from our spiritual tradition, or what have you, they're no longer in the subconscious filtering and applying bias to everything that comes in. We've now cleared those particular individuals. Now, of course, we all have lots of things that either permanently we've shoved into the shadow and need to be dealt with, or that spend time kind of moving in and out of the shadow. So it's something we should always be, all of us should always be questioning ourselves on. But I think that most people who are engaging in this, I'm just going to call it a lie. I wanted a nicer word for it, but I think that's really, let's call a spade a spade. Engaging in this lie that somehow they, in their human mind, have managed to capture the complete truth of all there is and the only truth of all there is, and that if you disagree with them, that you must be totally wrong. I mean, again, if you remove that from the religious context and you just say it like that, like it is, it just sounds very suspicious, especially if you're someone who's ever been in any kind of abusive relationship and managed to make your way out and now have recognized those patterns and know what those kind of people look like. Well, that's often what they look like, really, is you don't know what happened. I know what happened. Let me tell you what happened. Um, and so those of us who've been through those kind of experiences, all of that, it gets reflected to us in the religion. And that's part of why I ended up having to leave Christianity, is having left abusive relationships and abusive dynamics and really learning about them in such a way that it will less likely happen to me again in the future. I now started seeing abusive dynamics in lots of other places in the world and my life. And I started to notice that these truths that we say we have in Christianity just are really convenient for holding power over other people. And they make it so that they absolutely invalidate other people and other people's experiences. And I became deeply uncomfortable with that myself and ended up needing to make a change. But most people who haven't done that work, who have not dealt with shadow aspects, who have not come out of abusive relationships and examined them and learned the patterns so that they can try to avoid that in the future, and now they're seeing the patterns in other either work relationships, political relationships, religious relationships in their lives. If they haven't done that work, then they are swallowing this, and they are using these truths that lead to power over dynamics from a place of relative ignorance. And that doesn't mean it's good, for sure not, but it's very different than the people that certainly exist. Although I would say that there's probably fewer of these people who know exactly what they're doing, who intentionally, with complete self awareness, understand that this religion is an excellent tool to create a power over dynamic, and that's why they're doing everything. And that they often don't even really believe in the religion themselves. Honestly, Christianity has a terrible history around this, because the reason it became the religion of what then became the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore spread the way that it did, and crusades and on, is because Constantine saw that it was an extremely convenient way to hold political power over people. Far more convenient than the other religious traditions that were happening in Rome at the time, even though those had their own political places at one point. Christianity, this particular brand of Christianity that Constantine endorsed, um, it it was really convenient for that. And so the entirety of what we have roughly post Nicene Council on, if you happen to know anything about church history, is really based on intentionally creating a power over dynamic system. Even if, I don't know that every bishop who was at the Nicene Council was self-aware and intentionally knowing that they were doing that. But certainly Constantine was doing that. And he's the one who set up that whole thing and endorsed the Christianity that came out of it, and all of that. So it is just a very, very convenient way to create power over dynamics. And I do think that that's part of why it ends up being misinterpreted the way that it gets misinterpreted. Again, sometimes because people are doing things unconsciously or through subconscious means, and sometimes because they're doing it totally intentionally. I like to give people a lot of grace, though, because I know that a lot of times these unconscious things that are happening um, are really quite hidden from people who haven't done the internal work. So they may be acting in ways that they kind of don't understand. Maybe they sort of realize this isn't totally right, but they can't quite put their finger on why. And so it's uncomfortable to change. So we're just going to carry on the way we are. And of course, that's also not right. But it's a little better than people who know that what they are doing by selling you this spiritual tradition is creating a system of dependency on them and therefore a power over dynamic. And this applies, like I said, monotheism does not have the exclusive rights to this. There are plenty of other people who've taken various pieces of other traditions and done similar things, but monotheism is just really numerous right now as far as the groups that are monotheistic that are doing this and that are seen as being totally normal and correct and fine. And I just don't really think that's the case. I think there are certain brands of Christianity in particular, because again, that's the one I'm really familiar with, that are kind of moving away from that and are becoming more accepting of the fact that the truth may look lots of different ways, even though this is what they believe. But it's still pretty rare. And I honestly think that for most of us who start to challenge and question these ideas, most of us just end up becoming not monotheists. And a lot of people who question these ideas actually end up becoming atheists, which is a whole different ball of wax. And I think that it's another problematic situation for the people who are materialistic atheists in the sense of denying that there's any kind of anything spiritual happening. Obviously, if you're on this channel, you probably are not one of those people because this is all about spiritual stuff. So if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the little bell, because if you don't do that, YouTube is not necessarily going to tell you when these videos come out. And I know that you want to know when they come out. And also, definitely, I know this particular one was a little controversial, although the last one probably was too. And probably everything I'll talk about is controversial. So please comment. And if you have any questions that this video or the previous one or something else in your life brought up about something spiritual, definitely drop that in the comments, because I would love to do a video on whatever it is that's on your mind regarding spiritual topics. I do ask, as the things that I'm talking about are controversial, that we all try our hardest as a community to come from a place of love. And so whatever comments you have to make, even if you disagree with me, especially if you disagree with me, please try to send it through a filter of love before you put it in the comments. This is a big part of dealing with those shadow aspects that are keeping us restricted. They're keeping us small. They are allowing fear to be what controls us instead of our true selves. And one of the characteristics of our true selves is love. So the more that you can intentionally try to send things through a filter of love and act with love, the more you will be breaking down any shadow drives and bringing those things into the light to be loved. Again, these shadow aspects are just orphaned children that we have rejected, and they are our orphan children who are still living inside of us, and we've rejected them. So the goal is not to go through and, let's say, murder all of your shadow aspects, eliminate them. The goal is to bring them back into the home, bring them back into the fold. This is what we must do with all shadow aspects, whether they are external or internal. And of course, there is only one, and so there is only internal. I will leave you with that rather difficult spiritual thought. So I will see you next time. I still have a list of prompts that I'm going through that is certainly going to just keep expanding because I'm constantly having thoughts like this. But definitely, if there's something you want to see, pop it in the comments and that will take priority. Absolutely. There's lots of stuff that I want to yammer about, but if there's something that you want to hear about, then that's what I would like to talk about with priority for sure. All right, I will see you next time. Bye for now.